September 1944. A truck bed rattled across Nebraska farmland beneath a canvas stretched tight as a drum, carrying inside it a prisoner whose very presence had become something to whisper about in those rural towns. Carl Fisher sat among the shadows, 19 years old, his fingers curling and uncurling against his thighs in a rhythm he couldn't control. Golden cornfields swept past the gap in the canvas cover, but he barely saw them. His mind was somewhere else entirely, somewhere dark, spiraling through 15 months of confusion that had slowly hollowed out everything he'd been taught to believe. Back in the Africa Corps, the instruction had been relentless and absolute. American soldiers were barbarians. They tortured prisoners until they broke. They starved men deliberately, worked them like animals until their bodies gave out in the fields. Every German soldier knew the stories. Everyone knew them. Surrender to the Americans meant accepting a slow death, dressed up as something almost civilized. Better to die fighting than fall into their hands. That was what they'd drilled into him, over and over. But Carl had surrendered, and he hadn't died. That simple fact had spent the last 15 months tearing apart everything he'd been certain about. At Camp Aliceville in Alabama, they'd given him the same food American soldiers received. Meat appeared twice weekly on his plate. Vegetables, bread that actually tasted like bread instead of sawdust mixed with acorns. 80 cents a day in canteen coupons meant he could buy cigarettes, candy, sometimes even beer. Last Christmas, they'd served turkey and sung carols. When his friend Hans contracted pneumonia in February, the American doctors gave him penicillin, the same medicine they reserved for their own men, and Hans had lived. None of it made sense. None of it matched. The truck lurched around a curve, and Carl's stomach tightened. Beside him, Walter Brandt sat rigid and unchanged, the same 41-year-old schoolteacher from Hamburg who'd been captured early and spent nearly 2 years watching his hope die slowly, piece by piece. Walter hadn't spoken much during the ride. He didn't need to. His face said everything, said that kindness was just another trap, another door that would slam shut the moment you stepped through it. Up front, Lieutenant Davies sat with the driver, his back straight as a gun barrel despite the rutted farm road bouncing beneath them. He'd explained it all that morning while they loaded the truck outside the camp. Farmers were desperate for help. All the young men were overseas. Crops rotted in the fields while families watched their livelihoods die in the heat. So an arrangement had been made. The government would send prisoners to work the farms. Farmers would pay 45 cents an hour for that labor. Work started before dawn and didn't stop until dusk, 6 days a week. No guards, no fences at the farms. Everything based on the prisoner's honor. Davies had continued matter-of-factly, the way a man explains the rules before starting a card game. Any man who ran got sent to the hardship camp in Oklahoma. Anyone who worked hard and respected the farmer would be treated fairly in return. That was the Geneva Convention. That was how America did things. Walter had muttered something in German that wasn't a blessing. The truck slowed more, then stopped completely. Morrison Farm, the driver called back toward the canvas-covered bed. "Fisher, you're up." Carl's hands started shaking worse. He grabbed his small canvas bag, everything he owned in the world fit inside it, and climbed down. His legs felt unsteady, like he'd stepped off a ship instead of a truck. The farm spread out before him, larger and cleaner than anything he'd imagined. A 2-story white farmhouse stood with a wraparound porch. Beyond it, a massive red barn dominated the landscape, surrounded by outbuildings scattered across what looked like 160 acres. Cornfields rose tall, nearly ready for harvest. A handful of dairy cows grazed in a fenced pasture. It looked like Bavaria, just flatter, just more American. Then he saw her. A woman stood on the porch, small, perhaps 5 feet 2 inches at most, wearing a simple cotton dress and an apron. Dark hair pulled back in a practical bun. Her face was etched with work and weather and something else, something harder. She held something in her right hand, gripped so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Even from 30 feet away, Carl could see the rigid set of her shoulders, the militant straightness of her posture, like a soldier at attention. Lieutenant Davies walked toward her first, while Carl stayed by the truck, trying to make himself invisible, trying to take up as little space as possible. They spoke in low tones, but the woman's voice carried sharp across the yard anyway. "I know what I'm doing, Lieutenant. I need help, and you've got workers. That's the arrangement." A boy emerged from the barn, maybe 16 or 17, tall and gangly with his mother's dark hair, but his father's broad shoulders. His eyes found Carl's uniform and something twisted ugly across his young face. "You want us to let a German work our land?" The boy's voice cracked with rage and something raw underneath it. Grief that hadn't yet learned how to sit quietly. "Dad's body isn't even cold, and you're bringing one of them here." Carl flinched. He'd heard that tone before. From guards in the camps who'd lost brothers overseas. From townspeople when trucks passed through. From his own voice years ago in North Africa when he'd still believed the propaganda about everyone who wasn't German. The woman, Mrs. Morrison it had to be, didn't raise her voice, but it cut through the air like a knife through cloth. "Your father didn't die so we could lose this farm. Harvest comes in 3 weeks. Banknotes come due in 4. I need help, and I won't apologize for it." She walked down the porch steps and crossed the yard until she stopped 3 feet from Carl. Close enough now that he could see the exhaustion carved deep into her face, the way her jaw clenched against something trying to break through, the sheer force of will it took to keep grief held at bay. And he could see what she held in her hand. A telegram in its yellow Western Union envelope. The thing every family dreaded. "Can you work?" Her voice was flat, businesslike, stripped of anything that might be called sympathy. "Yeah. Yes, ma'am." Carl's English came out rough, but understandable. "I grew up on a farm near Munich. I know animals, I know machinery. Carpentry." She studied him for a long moment, really studied him. Searching for something in his face. Her eyes were grey, he noticed then. Grey like smoke. Grey like a sky before a storm. "You'll work 6 days a week, dawn to dusk. Sundays are yours. Breakfast at 6, lunch at noon, dinner at 5. I'll pack you dinner to take back to camp. You break something, you fix it. You slack off, you're gone. We clear?" "Yes, ma'am." She unfolded something she'd been holding. Not the telegram, he realized, but a letter, creased from being folded and unfolded so many times the paper was soft as cloth. Her voice wavered just slightly as she read aloud. "Sarah, if I don't make it home, promise me you'll be the person I always believed you to be. Don't let this war make you small." The words hung between them like something physical. Carl didn't move, barely breathed. Mrs. Morrison refolded the letter with careful hands and tucked it back into her apron pocket. When she looked at him again, her eyes were wet, but her voice stayed steady. "My husband wrote that 2 weeks before he died. In France, fighting your countrymen. I intend to keep that promise. But don't you dare make me regret this." "No, ma'am," Carl managed the words. "I won't." She nodded once, sharp and final, then turned away. "Tommy, show him the barn, then both of you wash up for supper." That night, back at camp, Carl lay on his bunk and stared at nothing. Around him, other men snored or muttered in their sleep. Someone cried quietly in the corner, homesick or grieving, or just worn down by the weight of being so far from everything familiar. The question that had started circling his mind wouldn't stop. What kind of people are these Americans? A widow whose husband had been killed by German bullets, a widow who'd fed him dinner anyway, who'd packed him a tin pail of food to take back to camp, who'd paid the government on his behalf for his labor. In Germany, prisoners were worked until they collapsed. Here, she treated him like he mattered. Like he was human. Carl pressed his trembling hands flat against the rough wool blanket. Tomorrow he'd return to the Morrison farm. He'd work hard. He'd earn the mercy she was offering, even though he didn't understand it. Even though nothing about this war made sense anymore. The work began before sunrise. Carl learned this on his second day when the truck dropped him at the farm in darkness, stars still visible overhead, frost covering the cornfield in a silver sheen that caught what little starlight there was. Mrs. Morrison was already in the barn, milking the Jersey cow by lantern light. She looked up when he entered, nodded once, and went back to her work. No greeting, no small talk, just the rhythmic sound of milk hitting the tin pail, steady as a heartbeat. Carl picked up a pitchfork and started mucking out the stalls. The work was familiar in his bones, pure muscle memory from his childhood in Bavaria. His father's farm had been smaller than this, only 60 acres, but the smells were identical. Hay and manure and animal warmth. For a moment, homesickness hit him so hard he had to stop and breathe through it, gripping the pitchfork handle like it was the only solid thing left in the world. "You know what you're doing?" Mrs. Morrison's voice came from behind him, not a question but an observation. "Yes, ma'am. I did this every morning before school since I was 8 years old." She studied him in the dim lantern light, then handed him the milk pail. "Take this to the house, then come back. We've got fence posts rotting in the south pasture. 3 of them gone soft all the way through. Wires are sagging." The days settled into a pattern that felt almost like a rhythm. Breakfast at 6. Eggs, bacon, toast, coffee brewed strong enough to strip paint. Tommy sat across from Carl at the kitchen table, eating mechanically, not speaking, not meeting his eyes, just leaving as soon as his plate was empty. Mrs. Morrison served Carl the same portions she gave her son, the same food. No difference. In Germany, prisoners ate what was left over, if anything remained. After breakfast, the real work began. Mending fence posts meant digging holes in soil that had gone hard as concrete, setting new cedar posts, stretching barbed wire that bit through gloves if you weren't paying attention. On the 3rd day, Carl cut his hand deep across the palm when a wire snapped under tension. Blood welled up dark and fast. Mrs. Morrison saw it happen. She didn't say anything, just walked to the house and returned with a first aid kit. She cleaned the wound with something that burned, wrapped it in clean white gauze, and told him simply, "Take the afternoon off. Infection will cost us more time than rest." Carl stared at her. "It's not bad. I can work." I said, "Take the afternoon off." He spent that afternoon in the barn, oiling tools and organizing equipment because sitting still felt wrong. Through the open door, he watched Mrs. Morrison work alone in the field, wrestling with fence posts by herself, her small frame straining against wood that would have been easier with 2 people helping. She was maybe half his size, but she worked like she was made of iron. Worked like stopping would kill her. That evening, back at camp, Walter Brandt found Carl in the mess hall. Walter worked at the Clark farm next door, a bigger operation with more land and an elderly widow who needed even more help than Mrs. Morrison. He sat down across from Carl with his tray. "How's your assignment?" "Hard work, but fair." Walter nodded slowly. "Mrs. Clark gave us Sunday dinner yesterday. Roast chicken, mashed potatoes, apple pie." His voice caught slightly. "She set the table like we were guests. Used her good plates. I haven't eaten at a family table in 6 years." Around them, the mess hall buzzed with similar conversations. German POWs comparing notes on their farm assignments. Most of the stories were the same. Hard work, fair treatment, farmers desperate enough to look past the uniforms. A few complained about hostile neighbors or cold shoulders, but no one reported abuse. No one was starving. No one was being worked to death. It confused all of them in ways they couldn't quite articulate. On the 7th day, it rained. Not the gentle Nebraska rain Carl had witnessed before, but a downpour that turned the yard to mud and made work impossible. Mrs. Morrison appeared at the barn, where Carl had taken shelter, and handed him an old slicker, worn canvas and faded fabric. "Wear this. You'll catch your death." Carl took it carefully, like it might burn him. It probably belonged to her dead husband. "I can't. It's just hanging in the closet getting moth-eaten. Put it on." He did. It was too big in the shoulders, but the length was right, and it smelled like oil and thyme and someone else's life. He buttoned it slowly, and Mrs. Morrison watched him without speaking, her grey eyes unreadable as always. The smell of tobacco mixed with machine oil and someone else's sweat filled the barn that morning. They spent the day side by side, preparing everything for the harvest ahead. The combine's gears needed fresh grease, careful work that took focus and time. The corn wagon required inspection. They checked each board for splits and weakness. Blades that had lost their edge over the long summer months had to be sharpened, restored to their proper bite. Mrs. Morrison understood every piece of equipment on that farm. She could listen to an engine and know exactly what had gone wrong. When the combine's motor began coughing and sputtering, she tilted her head, listened for just a few seconds, then spoke with absolute certainty. "Fuel lines clogged. Check the filter." She was correct, as always. Tommy showed up around midday carrying sandwiches wrapped in waxed paper. He gave one to his mother, paused for several seconds, then set another down near Carl without making eye contact. Maybe it meant something was shifting between them. Maybe it was just basic humanity. Carl couldn't be sure either way. "Thank you," he said in careful English. Tommy's jaw clenched tight, though he did nod, just barely. Then October swept in, bringing cold air and clear skies. The corn was ready, brown stalks brittle underfoot, kernels swollen and heavy with maturity. The harvest could start any day. Mrs. Morrison walked those fields every evening, testing the corn's moisture, using decades of knowledge to judge the exact moment to begin. Sometimes Carl walked with her, keeping his distance, watching what she watched, learning to recognize the signs that meant the time had come. One evening, she stopped walking and turned to face him directly. The setting sun turned everything golden, made her look less worn by time and sorrow. "Why did you join?" she asked. Her tone wasn't angry, only curious. Carl picked his words carefully. "I didn't choose. I was 17 when they arrived at my father's farm. They took all the boys old enough to fight. My father told them I was needed for harvest, but they didn't listen." "Did you believe what they told you?" she pressed. "About the war?" He wanted to say no. Wanted to claim he'd never accepted their lies, never let himself hate the way they demanded. But something in her directness required truth. "Yes," he admitted quietly. "At first they made it all sound noble, like we were saving our homeland, like everyone else meant us harm, like we were the heroes protecting everything that mattered." His hands trembled as he spoke, that shaking that had never completely left him. "I believed it until North Africa, until I actually saw what war meant, what we actually did." Mrs. Morrison nodded slowly, considering this. "Frank always said people could change. He believed in giving second chances. I thought he was foolish about that, too trusting." Her voice softened. "Maybe he understood something I didn't." Back at camp that evening, guards gathered around a radio, talking openly about the fighting. Carl caught pieces as he passed, Allied troops pushing deeper into German territory, cities falling one after another, the Reich crumbling from every direction. Tommy stood by the fence, listening with desperate hunger in his eyes, desperate for any word about France, where his father had fallen. Carl saw Tommy's face when a guard mentioned the Hurtgen forest, saw his hands clench into fists, saw the same weight of rage and loss that Carl had carried back from North Africa, that impossible grief with no place to go except anger. They were nearly the same age. Both had lost their youth to other men's choices. Both carried wounds that no doctor could treat. The next morning, Carl found Tommy already in the barn, wrestling with the disc plow. One blade had bent badly, and the entire assembly sat crooked and useless. The boy was trying to force it back into shape with a wrench, using pure strength, frustration carved into every line of his face. Carl watched for a moment, then picked up a larger wrench and a wooden block. "If you try bending it cold like that, it'll snap," he said quietly. "We need heat first." Tommy glared at him. "I don't need your help, I know that, but the plow does." They stood staring at each other for a long moment. Then Tommy's shoulders dropped and he stepped back. Carl built a small fire, heated the bent blade until it glowed deep red. Then he carefully worked it back into alignment, using the wooden block as a guide. Tommy watched, and after a minute he started helping without being asked. When they finished, the boy said quietly, "My dad taught me how to fix things. He was really good at it." "Your mind's good too," Carl said. "I think all farmers have that skill." Tommy nearly smiled. Nearly. Mrs. Morrison found them an hour later, both covered in grease from head to foot, the disc plow reassembled and functional once again. She looked at the plow, then at her son, then at Carl, and something shifted in her expression. Not quite forgiveness, but perhaps its first steps. "Breakfast in 10 minutes, she said. "Both of you wash up first." Harvest week arrived that first Monday in November, under perfectly cloudless skies, with temperatures ideal for combining. Lieutenant Davies arranged for additional POW workers, assigning 3 more Germans to help both the Morrison and Clark farms together. Walter came, along with Friedrich, a quiet boy from Dresden who barely spoke anymore since learning his family had died in the firebombing, and Josef, a former mechanic from Berlin who could repair anything with moving parts. They worked from dawn until darkness fell, and the rhythm felt almost like joy. The combine roared across the fields, cutting and threshing in a single pass, golden kernels spilling into the waiting wagon. Carl drove the tractor. Tommy rode the combine, and the others rotated between shoveling corn into wagons and hauling loads to the granary. Gold dust hung in the air like powder suspended in light. The work was exhausting, but there was music in it, the steady beat of machinery and human effort moving together. Mrs. Morrison worked alongside them, matching their pace hour after hour. She drove the truck when wagons needed moving, climbed into the granary to level corn when it piled unevenly, and kept cold water flowing from the pump for anyone who needed it. At mid-morning she brought out apples and cheese. At lunch, sandwiches appeared with thick ham and bread still warm from the oven. The other POWs stared at the food with disbelief. In the Africa Corps toward the end, Walter said quietly, sitting in the barn's shadow, "We got 400 calories a day, sometimes less. We caught rats when we could, boiled boot leather when we couldn't." His hands shook as he unwrapped his sandwich. "Here you feed us like human beings." Mrs. Morrison had been walking past with another basket. She stopped, studied Walter for a long moment, then set the basket down and sat on an overturned crate nearby. "My husband believed in the Geneva Convention. He believed that treating prisoners with respect meant our soldiers might receive the same treatment." Her eyes moved from Walter to Carl to the others. "I don't know if that's true. Don't know if Frank's captors showed him any mercy. But I know what he'd want me to do." Carl's voice came out rough with unexpected emotion. "I'm sorry about your husband. About all of it." "You are," she said, meeting his eyes directly for the first time in weeks, really looking at him, and her face softened. "You're all just boys. You're children, not soldiers." That afternoon, the old Morrison truck backfired while Tommy was driving it, a sound exactly like a rifle shot that echoed across the field. All 5 POWs dropped instantly to the ground, years of combat instinct overriding thought. They lay in the dirt for 3 seconds before realizing it was just machinery. Just a truck malfunction, not incoming fire. Tommy jumped out, face burning with embarrassment. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean—" Friedrich started laughing first. Then Josef joined in, and soon all of them were laughing, that relieved, absurd laughter that comes when terror turns to nothing. Even Tommy cracked a smile. "Your truck sounds like a Panzer," Carl said, still grinning. "Needs a new carburetor," Josef added. "I can fix it tonight if you have the parts." Tommy looked at his mother. She nodded, so he said, "Fix it." By the end of the week, both farms were harvested completely. The Morrison granary stood packed nearly to the rafters for the first time in 3 years. Mrs. Clark's yield was even better. The old widow came over on Friday evening with a pie, found them all cleaning equipment in the barn, and insisted they come to her house for supper. "I won't hear any arguments," she said firmly. "You boys worked yourselves to exhaustion. Least I can do is feed you properly." Lieutenant Davies approved it, and an hour later Carl sat at a dining room table covered with white linen, with good china plates, roast chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, and fresh rolls still steaming. Mrs. Clark said grace, her voice wavering, and Carl realized she was crying. "I lost 2 sons in the First War," she said when she finished. "James and Robert, 19 and 21, died in France in 1918. She looked around the table at the Germans and Americans sitting together. "I spent 26 years hating Germans for taking my boys, 26 years of poison eating me alive." She wiped her eyes, but hatred never brought them back, didn't make anything better, just made the world smaller and colder. Walter adjusted an invisible pair of glasses, an old habit from teaching days. "I lost my wife and my daughters in Hamburg. Allied bombs, they burned." His voice stayed steady, but his hands trembled. "I hated all of you for it. Hated myself for surviving when they didn't." To absent loved ones, Mrs. Morrison said quietly, raising her glass of water, "On all sides." They drank together, Americans and Germans, widows and orphans, prisoners and free people. all of them casualties of the same machine of hatred. The work continued through November, but something had changed in the air. Tommy began teaching Carl American slang during lunch breaks, laughing when Carl pronounced words wrong, mangling English with his thick accent. Carl taught Tommy basic German, counting, greetings, and the colorful curses any teenage boy wanted to know. They fixed the truck together, Joseph giving directions, and when it finally started without backfiring, Tommy whooped and clapped Carl on the shoulder hard enough to hurt. Mrs. Morrison started sharing stories about Frank during dinner. Small memories at first, how he always sang while working, how he could never remember where he left his tools, how he'd cried when both his children were born. Her voice would catch sometimes, and she'd need to pause and collect herself. But she kept talking, kept speaking Frank's name out loud. One evening, Walter helped Tommy with algebra homework at the kitchen table while Carl and Mrs. Morrison washed dishes together. The ordinariness of it struck Carl as almost unbearably strange. 6 months ago, he'd been in a prison camp in Alabama, certain he'd never know normal life again. Now he was drying dishes in a Nebraska farmhouse while a German teacher explained mathematics to an American boy whose father had died fighting Germans. "The neighbors talk," Mrs. Morrison said quietly, scrubbing a pot. "Some think I've lost my mind, feeding enemy prisoners at my table, treating you like family." "And the others?" he asked. She smiled, small but genuine. "Maggie Clark tells them to mind their own business. Says if a woman who lost 2 sons to Germans can make peace, they can stop complaining." Sunday came around, the one day off. Carl spent it at camp writing letters home. He'd been avoiding it for months, not knowing what to say, but now the words came. He wrote to his mother in German. "I am treated like a human being here, better than I treated myself in the war. The Americans feed us well and pay us fairly. The widow whose farm I work lost her husband to our army, but she shows me mercy I don't deserve. I don't understand why they're kind when they have every reason to hate, but I'm grateful. I'm grateful to be alive and fed and treated with dignity. I hope you and Anna are safe. I hope I can see you again when the war ends. I hope I can bring home what I've learned, that enemies can become something else if we let them." He sealed the envelope, knowing it might never arrive, knowing mail to Germany was uncertain at best. But writing it made the strange new life feel more real somehow. When Monday morning came, Carl climbed into the truck, feeling something close to eagerness. The Morrison farm was starting to feel like a second home. The work was hard but honest. The people were complicated but decent. For the first time since his capture, Carl could imagine something beyond mere survival. Could imagine building something good from the ashes of everything the war had destroyed. The news arrived on a cold Tuesday in mid-November. Guards gathered around a radio in the administration building, their voices carrying across the yard in fragments that made Carl's stomach drop. Germany's Ardennes offensive, a massive push through Belgium. American lines broken, casualties climbing by the hour. The Battle of the Bulge had begun. Carl heard the name before he understood what it meant. Heard it whispered in the mess hall, spoken between guards who suddenly looked at the POWs with different eyes. The easy warmth of Harvest Week evaporated overnight. An American sergeant who'd always been decent toward them spat near Carl's feet and muttered something about Nazi bastards. Walter sat across from him, hands shaking around his coffee cup. "It's changing, you feel it? The more Americans die over there, the more they'll hate us here." Carl felt it in the truck ride to the Morrison farm, the driver silent and stone-faced instead of making conversation about weather. Felt it when they drove through town and someone threw a rock that clanged off the truck bed. Felt it in the red paint splashed across the camp fence overnight. "Nazis go home," written 3 feet tall. At the farm, Tommy met him at the barn door, face white, eyes red-rimmed. "My uncle, my dad's brother, he was in the Ardennes." Past tense. Carl's mouth went dry. "I'm sorry." "You're sorry," Tommy's voice cracked and rose. "Your people just killed another member of my family, and you're sorry." "I didn't want this war. You think that matters? You think it matters what you wanted?" Tommy stepped closer, hands tight fists. "My dad was 40 years old. He had a choice, and he went anyway because your country started this whole thing. Now his brother's dead too, and you're here, safe, eating our food, while more Americans die fighting Germans. I was 17, Carl said, his own rage surfacing, hot and unexpected. They came to my father's farm and took every boy old enough. I didn't choose this. You think I wanted to leave my mother alone? My sister? You think I wanted to watch my friends die in the desert for something I stopped believing in? Enough! Mrs. Morrison's voice cut through the barn like a blade. She stood in the doorway, silhouetted against morning light. And Carl saw immediately that something inside her had broken. The yellow Western Union truck had come to the drive. "Tommy, go inside." Her voice was hollow, without feeling. "But Mum." "Inside. Now." The boy left, shooting Carl a look of pure hatred. Mrs. Morrison stood silent for a long moment, her hand pressed against her apron pocket where she kept Frank's letter. When she finally spoke, her voice was thin, brittle. "Take today off. Tomorrow I'll make sure Lieutenant Davies knows what happened here." "I think you should just go," Mrs. Morrison said, and Carl nodded, understanding what she meant beneath the words. He walked back toward the road. The truck wouldn't show up for several hours, so he covered the 3 miles on foot, his hands buried deep in his pockets, caught between shame and anger that churned inside him. As he passed the Clark farm, he could see Walter and the others still out in the fields working, but something had shifted. The atmosphere felt wrong, different in a way that made his stomach tighten. That easy feeling they'd created together, that fragile peace they'd built, had evaporated like morning mist. It was gone. That evening, someone hurled eggs at their transport truck. The shells burst against the canvas covering, spilling their contents in bright yellow rivulets that ran downward. When Friedrich stepped down from the truck, a woman standing nearby spat directly at him. An elderly man bellowed that they should all be executed. Inside the dining hall, the air felt heavy and tense. The men ate in complete silence or huddled together speaking in hushed, urgent tones. Word began trickling in from Germany. Allied aircraft dropping bombs on cities every hour, day and night without stopping. Russian soldiers advancing relentlessly from the east, pushing toward Berlin, the German state crumbling like ancient stone. A letter arrived for someone in the barracks, handed down like contraband, carrying news that his entire hometown no longer existed. Everything burned away. Everyone gone. Walter appeared while Carl sat by himself after the meal ended. The man seemed to have aged a decade since that afternoon at harvest time. His eyes had lost whatever small spark of hope they'd held before. All that brightness simply drained out. "They threw eggs at us today," Walter said quietly. Someone spat right on Friedrich's face. He adjusted his glasses, though they weren't actually there, a nervous habit Carl had noticed before. "I warned you, don't ever rely on their kindness. It only lasts until something changes, and then it disappears completely." Carl wanted to push back, wanted to defend Mrs. Morrison and what she'd shown them both, but the words wouldn't come. He wanted to tell Walter that her compassion had been genuine, that what she'd offered was real and not just surface politeness. Only she'd sent him away, told him to stay gone for 2 days. Perhaps Walter had it right after all. Perhaps everything good here was simply borrowed time, destined to vanish the second the cost became too high. That night, Carl heard weeping coming through from the neighboring barracks, deep, uncontrollable sobs that pierced through the thin walls separating them. Someone was mourning relatives they would never embrace again, someone cracking under the weight of being despised for participating in a conflict they'd never chosen. Locked away in a prison camp on another continent, while everything he cherished was destroyed or perishing, or already lost forever. We're all casualties, Carl thought as he lay awake staring at darkness. Different soldiers, yet the same loss, the same desperation, the same inability to change anything. Wednesday arrived and Carl didn't go to the Morrison farm. He remained at camp, working on machinery repairs and upkeep, deliberately pushing away any thoughts of working beside Mrs. Morrison in the yard, or that easy, satisfying routine of the harvest. He wouldn't let himself think about Tommy's almost smile when showing him new American words. Wouldn't acknowledge the hollow feeling left by something he'd barely recognized before it was stripped away. Thursday morning brought Lieutenant Davies to the barracks with surprising instructions. "The Morrison farm is requesting you for a day," she announced. "You and Brent both. She says she's behind on work and needs the help." Carl locked eyes with Walter across the barracks. Short-handed made no sense. Mrs. Morrison had managed that land by herself before he ever arrived. This meant something else entirely. The truck pulled up the drive to find the farmhouse glowing with warmth and light, yellow windows bright against the overcast morning. Mrs. Morrison stood waiting at the door, and something in her appearance had changed. For the first time in weeks, her face wasn't locked tight with sorrow. She looked worn down, exhausted, but something fundamental had shifted inside her. "Come inside," she said, opening the door wider. "Both of you, I've got coffee and breakfast ready, and we've got work waiting." The kitchen filled Carl's nose with the scent of cinnamon and evergreen branches. Tommy was sitting at the table, and when he saw Carl enter, his expression remained guarded. No anger flashing in his eyes, but no warmth either, just a slight nod, a small acknowledgement. A beginning. They ate breakfast together, eggs, bacon, bread toasted golden and spread thick with butter and preserves. When Mrs. Morrison said grace, her voice cracked on certain words and her eyes glistened. "And help us see your face in all people, even when that's terribly hard, especially when it's hard." Tommy's head jerked up at that. "That's exactly what Dad used to say," he said, voice strained, "every single holiday." Carl set down his fork, his throat suddenly tight. "My mother has said the same thing to me since I was small. She says God doesn't recognize uniforms. He doesn't see the army badges." Walter lifted his coffee cup with a hand that trembled slightly. "To those we're missing," he said quietly. "On every side of this war." They raised their cups, mismatched plates and worn ceramic mugs, and drank in shared silence. An American widow grieving her fallen husband, her boy wrestling with loss and confusion, a German prisoner who'd surrendered everything to this war. Another German, now thousands of miles from his kin, living safely while his family faced starvation or death. After the plates were cleared, Mrs. Morrison left the room briefly and returned carrying a wrapped parcel. "This is for you both," she said. "For everyone back at camp, really." Inside lay dozens of cookies wrapped carefully in waxed paper, gingerbread and delicate star-shaped sugar cookies dusted with sparkle. "Frank always believed Christmas meant remembering we're all human," she explained, her voice wavering. "All of us belong to the same God, even when we forget it. Even when we choose to forget it." Carl's hand found the carved wooden star in his pocket. He pulled it out slowly, suddenly uncertain. "I made this for your tree, if you'd want it there." Mrs. Morrison received it like something precious, running her fingertips across the polished surface. Her eyes grew bright with tears, but she was smiling. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "Tommy, would you help me hang this?" The two of them stood before the decorated tree, all four of them together, and Tommy reached high to secure the star on a low branch where the light would catch it and make it shine. It seemed so small and simple beside the other ornaments, yet somehow it fit perfectly, like it had always belonged there. "Thank you," Mrs. Morrison said to Carl, eyes still shining, "for helping me remember that kindness matters, that people on opposite sides can become something more." She paused, searching for words that could hold what she meant, become something altogether better. They spent that afternoon working the land together, and the tension that had hardened everything for weeks began to crack. Tommy demonstrated the correct way to sharpen an axe blade, teaching instead of resenting. Walter shared stories from his years as a schoolteacher in Hamburg before the war, his words drawing laughter even from Mrs. Morrison. They were simply people working side by side, the uniforms and national flags suddenly less important than what needed doing. As the sun descended and painted the fresh snow in shades of gold and rose, Carl stood in the farmyard and felt something dormant inside him stir awake. Hope, not the blind kind that ignored their circumstances or pretended the world wasn't breaking apart around them. This was earned hope, built carefully on the foundation of human beings choosing mercy when cruelty was available and justified. Mrs. Morrison came to stand beside him, pulling her coat tight against the sharp cold. "When this war eventually ends, when you go back home, I want you carrying something with you." She pressed an envelope into his hands. Frank's letters. About what he held true, about why he entered that fight, not to conquer Germany, but to liberate it from the force strangling it, about the kind of peace he hoped the world might build afterward. Karl accepted it with shaking fingers. "Why are you giving me these?" "Because you're going back to a place in ruins," she said simply. "And broken places need people who carry the memory that compassion is possible, that enemies can choose to become something else, that hatred isn't the only option available." She met his gaze steadily. "We'll write to you, we'll send parcels when we're able. You won't face whatever comes next alone." Karl found no words could pass the thickness in his throat. He just nodded, acknowledging what she was offering. "Thank you," Mrs. Morrison continued, "for becoming the person you chose to be in this place, for stepping away from what soldiers are made to be and deciding who you wanted to become instead, for choosing it when the choice cost you everything."